And we're all for the test already?
Yeah, I just opened. So they're on the live stream. They're going into the camera, going into the features.
Thank you.
See the guy in the hallway? There's a guy in the hallway recording something too.
get started in just a couple of minutes here, so please take your seats, and then we'll get going here in just a moment. We are live on our YouTube channel already, so thank you to our technical folks in the back who are working the cameras and the audio. We'll get started soon. Thanks for being here. All right. Maybe we'll speed it up. We'll get started now. So thank you all for being here. My name is Joseph Jiha. I'm a senior reporter at San Jose Spotlight. And I'd like to just welcome everyone to our first San Jose Spotlight event of 2023, De-Escalate, a conversation on public safety. And we'll start with a special thank you to our sponsors. That's La Raza Roundtable and the African American Community Services Agency. So thank you for helping us put on this event that we think is going to be a great discussion tonight on a very important topic. We'd also like to thank everyone who's joined us here tonight in person in the audience and who are watching us at home on the live stream. Thank you for your time and attention. The way our format is going to work tonight is our panelists here are going to discuss a few questions with us. I'm going to be moderating the conversation. We have shared some of these questions in advance with our panelists so that they have prepared substantive answers, hopefully, and things that we can actually have good discussion on. We're also hoping for a little bit of free-flowing discussion tonight, so we're not just going to be sticking to a script per se. And then also at the end of this event, we'd like to offer some time for Q&A from the audience members if we have time for that. And so if you have a question you'd like to ask either now or if something comes up that inspires you during the conversation, just raise your hand, flag down one of our volunteers here. Jenna here, we have Josh, Ramona. People will be looking out for that, and they can give you a note card to write your question on. And then that question can come up here later, and we'll take them as we have time. So let's get started. Let's meet our panelists. We'll start at the far end of the table here. We have Darcy Green. Darcy Green is a community health advocate, and she served on San Jose's Reimagining Public Safety Advisory Group. We also have Derek Sanderlin, and Derek is a community organizer who's led bias training with the San Jose Police Department. And then we have Santa Clara County Sheriff Bob Johnson here, just elected in 2022. Bob has more than 35 years of law enforcement experience, including serving as the former chief of the Palo Alto Police Department. And here on my right, closest to me, we have Chief Pat Nicolai of the city of Santa Clara, who has served in that department since 1992 and as chief since 2020. So thank you all for being here. Let's get started. So we'll start with Sheriff Johnson. Our first question is about your predecessor, Sheriff Lori Smith. She faced a lot of challenges under her leadership, such as the beating death of a mentally ill man in the county jail, Michael Tyree, by correctional officers, as well as severe injuries to others and a pay-to-play scandal over concealed carry permits. What changes are you and your office implementing to rebuild trust with the community and your relationship with the community as a whole?
Great question. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm really honored to be here with you tonight. One of the things that's been interesting, and as was mentioned, I've only been in this position now for just over 90 days. So the transition has been going actually very well, but there have been a lot of issues, and obviously it's no secret they've been under a cloud of controversy for several years. So part of the transition, and we'll be coming out with a 100-day report actually in the very near future. By the end of the month, hopefully we'll have that completed, really outlining what we've accomplished in those first 100 days during this transition. But to the question that you posed, I think it's really important in rebuilding that trust with the community. One of the things that I talked about in the campaign and was a high priority when I came into the organization was to finally get that contract, that relationship with Oakland, the independent auditor, in place and active. It's been something that's been kind of there for 3 years, but they still haven't reported publicly on anything within the sheriff's office. And so we expanded that information sharing agreement quite broadly, actually, to include all the uses of force, investigations, complaints. And we're bringing them closer into the organization so they can see how investigations are going while they're progressing. So I think that's really important. I think that's very critical that they actually start reporting out to the community on what's going on within the organization, especially around accountability. And that's something I'm proud that we're working on quite a bit, modifying policies, protocols. As you know, the Sheriff's Office is already under tremendous oversight with the consent decrees, the Attorney General's office, and now with the independent auditor. So we welcome that. The other things that we've done immediately is start creating community advisory groups, which I think are important for that conversation to be ongoing with our community members. So both patrol divisions, bureaus are working on that, both West Valley and our headquarters patrol, to get that in place. And we're also, as far as the CCW component of that question, we went live last week on our new Permitium system, where all the applications will be done electronically, independent of sheriff's oversight. That processing will be controlled by an outside vendor. I've also added into the component, which is new, a psychological exam, which I think is critically important for anybody who wants to apply for a CCW. In addition, I've expanded the training requirement by doubling it, what the standard is, 8 hours of training. I made it a mandatory 16 hours of training. So we will see where that goes, because there's also legislation in place moving forward in Sacramento that may even enhance some of the areas, or actually decrease some of the areas where people can carry concealed firearms if they're granted those permits. So we'll see how it goes. But again, a lot of work in front of me. I'm well aware of that, and I welcome the opportunity. So thank you for the question.
Thank you, Sheriff. And also, just like to follow up and clarify, so you're saying the new outside vendor is going to oversee that process, so essentially saying you yourself wouldn't have personal influence over who gets a permit and not. Is that correct?
Well, it's interesting, because as in California, as you know, it's a May issue state, or generally is considered May issue with concealed firearm permits, concealed weapon permits. So what it's really become, due to the Supreme Court decision, is more in line with a shall issue. If somebody applies, they make it through the application process, don't have any disqualifying factors, then yes, and they meet all the other requirements of that agency, we appoint it. So there's really not a lot of room for discretion. What is changing in this county, Santa Clara County, is a lot of people will now be able to actually apply directly with their city municipality if they have one. Otherwise, we will, as a sheriff, still process those applications.
Thank you for clarifying. We have a follow-up for you, Sheriff, and then we'll get some questions to our other panelists. More recently, your department came under fire a little bit for an insensitive tweet on Valentine's Day. It made a joke about providing free rides to jail for people with outstanding warrants who forgot to buy a gift for their loved one on Valentine's Day. Some in the community have said this is kind of indicative of a disrespectful culture toward the residents and the general public. How do you respond to that? How are you addressing that?
Yeah, definitely. It was an unfortunate social media interaction with our community, something that I immediately saw and also agreed was insensitive. And again, that's one of the things that I think is critically important as a new leader into an organization, is making it very clear what my expectations are within the organization. And that was a conversation I immediately had with our PIO, is that this is not something that is indicative of my values or our values or our expectations, and I would not expect it to happen again. And I have pretty good assurance it won't, because I have made that explicitly clear, not only to our PIO, but to everyone within the organization, of my expectation of respect for everyone that we engage with.
Thank you, Sheriff. Is that a little hot? I'm going to keep that farther away. Thank you. Okay. We'll move on to Derek. Derek, you have extensive experience working with San Jose's police department, providing bias training for officers, helping them to be more cognizant of how they use, how they deal with their biases in policing. What do we know? What can you share with us about officers who are biased in their day-to-day work, and how can they be held accountable or removed from the force if it is a serious issue?
Hey, everybody. So, full transparency, I haven't done the procedural justice training or implicit bias training since the pandemic started. So I can't speak to the nature of the culture in SJPD right now as it stands. I will say that what we know about officers who have implicit bias is that it exists in everybody, and that there's not much else that we can know. There isn't a way to measure the success of an implicit bias training and whether or not it's actually changing the culture of the department. Or at least there's no direct correlation that I am privy to. And except for brutality complaints and officer-involved shootings, which happen every year. And so, and may not even be the best barometer. So I think, how do we hold them accountable? It's really hard to say. There's not a whole lot of options. There are currently laws in place for the state for decertification process, but because of the arbitration process and the labor union, the police union in particular, oftentimes officers get reinstated or just move to a different jurisdiction and continue putting on the uniform. So I think for myself and for a lot of the folks that I organize with, the question for us has been, how many more times are we going to try to force accountability, force understanding of implicit bias, and when are we going to try to look at something new? Because there are plenty of other areas that police address that could be rightly addressed by someone else. And so that is a hard truth. I think both the sheriff and the chief probably have had their share of experiences where you have a tough employee, and it's hard to get rid of them. And I think it is really, really hard to try and navigate this system as it keeps adapting to different people's misbehavior.
Thank you for addressing the question. We appreciate it. And thank you for sharing the detail and the timing of your last time you were doing bias training with the department. We appreciate that. Should just note for our audience here and online that we did invite the San Jose Police Department Chief Anthony Mata to join us, as well as the San Jose Police Officers Association. Both the chief and the association declined to participate in the discussion. So we have some questions that are around San Jose's police force. We're not going to be able to hear from them directly because they declined to be here, but we do appreciate Derek's comments there. And also, I believe, just on the topic of bias, the state had looked into 5 different departments across the state recently, found that there were, a lack of quality dealings with bias across several departments, including San Jose. And at a recent city council meeting, I believe we heard San Jose's police department officers have seen several hundred complaints of biased policing, but only one sustained over the last several years. So it does either appear to be something that's very hard to prove or very hard to deal with in an official documented capacity. Darcy, you served on San Jose's Reimagining Public Safety Advisory Board. Can you share what that process was like and tell us some of the top recommendations that board provided to the city council? And then just kind of as a wrap-up, do you feel these recommendations have led to any meaningful reforms so far?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Darcy Green, Community Health Advocate. I'd like to say that there are a few RIPS members here in the audience, and I just want to acknowledge that there are folks here, because what was so special about the Reimagining Public Safety process at the City of San Jose was that it was community-led, right? It centered the voices of people who have been impacted and harmed, who have been harmed by violence, who have been harmed by quote-unquote crime, and who have been harmed by the police, right, in our system of policing here in this city. And we came up with 50 very exciting proposals, and so few of them actually centered policing, because there is so much more to public safety and the ways that we together keep each other safe than policing. And what we learned, and much in keeping with what Derek has already said, what we learned from that process, or what I took away from that process, is that our community doesn't want safety that comes at the expense of Black lives. Our community does not want safety that comes at the expense of brown lives and immigrant lives and foster youth and the lives of people with disabilities. It is a very high cost to pay. Policing is a very expensive way to address, and I'm not even talking about the financial expense, right? It's harmful, and it comes at the expense of many lives that are taken social deaths, and a lot of resource that's extracted from our communities. And we learned, much like what Derek said earlier, and we came up with 50 ways, or at least 40 of those were ways where we could achieve true safety in our communities, not by investing in policing, but by investing in our communities. And so some of the things that we prioritize, the city hasn't yet moved on any of those priorities. And I know they had lots and lots and lots of proposals thrown their way with many other commissions that were working on them, so there was hundreds of them. But we're confident that based on the mayor's budget, that memo that's come out, and recent conversations with council, that this is the year that we will move on some of them, and some of them that we have prioritized that we think are really important and very doable. One of them is a community-based response to interpersonal violence, thinking about how we utilize our existing social networks to intervene and prevent interpersonal violence in our communities, decriminalizing homelessness so that we can actually work on humanizing each other, right, and being there for each other, and investment in safer street design and streets and program streets so that our streets are places for preventing harm and not just enforcing it after the fact. So it was a year-long process, this reimagining public safety process, deeply led by community, deeply centered in the voices of the most impacted people, and we're very, very proud of the report that came out and sincerely hope that the council takes that up. And just to reiterate that the beauty of it is how much we imagined as a community group how we could achieve safety by believing in each other, trusting each other, and humanizing each other radically.
Okay, thank you, Darcy, for the detailed response. We appreciate it. Let's move on, staying in the county, but to the city of Santa Clara. Chief Nicolai, thanks for being here. You have this benefit of a long lens, having been with the department since the 90s, so we can ask you to kind of summarize, if you will, several decades, 3 decades of changes, if there have been any. So in your view, what changes have been made within the Santa Clara Police Department since you joined the force to improve police and community relations? And as a follow-up to that, how is your department now under your leadership building trust with the community and addressing the issue of bias policing that we've been talking about here?
Okay, 30 years of changes. How much time do I have? So let me just cover some of the highlights, some of the current plans that we have in place to deal with some of these issues. We have a community response team. We have a dedicated unit that handles community-related issues, those quality of life issues. Like Darcy mentioned, there's more to policing than just police work, and we understand that. So we want to reach out to the community and help them in any way that we can. Additionally, we just added the crisis intervention specialists to our community response team. And these are officers that have special training to deal with mental health issues. I know mental health issues are a very hot button topic, as in should the police department be handling those issues? I think there's a question for that later. And it's one of those things that we would love to get help from other people, but unfortunately, the police department is the one that is called, especially at 9 p.m. on a Friday night when there's someone having a mental health crisis with a handgun. They're going to call the police, and so we need to be trained to help those people. One of the things we did was we taught DARE. I know it's a kind of an old-fashioned thing, but before the pandemic, we taught DARE in schools. And you might question, is DARE effective? And I would debate that with you, but I won't debate the fact that these positive interaction with the youth is invaluable, and that's something that we should be promoting constantly. One of the things we did was we created a Chiefs Advisory Committee. So we have a diverse cross-section of Santa Clara residents that listen to ideas that we have at the police department and give us feedback. One of the things that police often do is we come up with these ideas in a vacuum, and we think this is a great idea. How could this go wrong? And this is the kind of group that we can talk about and say, hey, what do you think about this idea? And we can change our plans and we can get some feedback. We also host a multitude of community events, Coffee with a Cop, Citizens Police Academy, Chat with a Chief. Again, just getting that one-on-one communication with people, that's the way you build relationships. And so when you talk about specifically about bias training, we have implicit bias training both in person and online that all our officers have attended. But most importantly is after the George Floyd murder, I and the mayor created a diversity, equity, and inclusion task force for the city of Santa Clara. And their mission was to review not only the police department, but the entire city to see if there's ways we could make ourselves better. And so we actually had a subcommittee of that group that came to the police department, reviewed all of our policies, reviewed our use of force policies, the entire department. And I'm happy to say their draft report was extremely positive. We got really good reviews. As a matter of fact, they said city should increase our budget, which is music to my ears. So I think we're doing a lot to reach out and get those positive relationships.
Thank you for addressing it, and thanks for sharing several of the programs that you guys are running right now. Let's go back to Sheriff Johnson. Calls dealing with homeless or mentally ill individuals, like we were just discussing, have stressed law enforcement departments across Silicon Valley, across the state even. This has led to calls to either defund police altogether or pull money from police budgets, so reallocate money into community organizations and community services. Since police budgets are often one of the largest in a city, or in this case the county might have larger budgets, but often cities' budgets are made up of 30, 40, 50% by the police department. What are your thoughts about pulling funding from departments, from policing, to fund alternative responses to and alternative services?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. This has been going on for several years, this conversation about alternative responses. And one of the things that I actually will say I'm very impressed with the county of Santa Clara, and my relationship really started while I was the chief of Palo Alto, because even in Palo Alto, we realized we needed to look at how we were responding to mental health crisis. What could we do? What services could we provide? And we were one of the first municipalities that actually implemented the psychiatric emergency response team. And that was similar to what the chief was talking about, not only training our officers in critical incident management, but also training them into mental health. And we were really fortunate because we actually had an officer who had a degree in psychology. He was the first officer selected for that position. And a psychiatric emergency response team is a team that puts an officer in the car with a mental health clinician. And they respond to calls together to mitigate, de-escalate those calls, provide services needed, access to services. Very, very positive approach. And for the county, now that I'm the sheriff of the county, we have 2 of those teams in place as well. And that's really important partnership. And it's only one piece, though. It is the law enforcement piece, which is a great mitigator. And year to date for the sheriff's office, they've had that team in place since 2021. And those teams alone have responded to over 300 calls involving a mental health crisis. Now think about this for a minute. 300 calls for a mental health crisis on 2 teams alone. They've been able to provide services and access to services to over 500 of those incidents, meaning multiple responses, multiple services. But out of those 300, they've only had to make 1 arrest. They've been able to find alternative ways to get those people the help they needed rather than incarceration. I really believe that's a model that agencies need to be building upon. With that said, to your question, as far as defunding, I think it's going to require funding more strategically. But why I'm so impressed with Santa Clara County, as I mentioned, the PERT approach is one aspect of that layer. Because in the Santa Clara County, they have the mobile response teams, which are not facilitated by officers, but those are mental health clinicians that are responding to the non-emergent calls and the calls where the crisis has not reached a level of violence. They can go maybe after or the next day. And then there's a trust program. So there's these 3-tier approach. And between all 3, I think that's where we're going to find success. And we're in the infancy of that partnership. So give it a couple of years. And I think Santa Clara County is going to be a model for how we respond to mental health. So I'm very excited about being part of that equation.
Thank you. Appreciate the response. We're at about a halfway point here, so I'm going to remind everyone that if any of these responses are inspiring a question in you, something you'd like more detail about, we may not be able to get to all of them, but we would encourage you to raise your hand and ask for a note card. We have a question for all the panelists now, so we're going to start with Derek and Darcy just to kind of keep going in order. And the question is a very simple one, which is, what does equity in policing look like to you? So we'll start with Derek.
So I think it's really important to mention that whether or not you believe in defunding the police, let me say that again. Whether or not you believe in defunding the police, there there are some fundamental changes that need to happen in our society for people to feel really safe, for people to feel safe. And so I think part of equity in policing means, acknowledging folks like Anthony Nunez, some nuanced questions about what happens when somebody has a gun and when. You know, there's some folks who are about to take their own life and lose it instead. And so we need to start asking some of those more nuanced questions and start having more justice for those families who have lost lives to police violence. I think also equity in policing also means relinquishing some of the responsibilities that you hold on to, and letting some other folks take care of it. Funding things that really get at the root of the problem, so that we're not always in a crisis mode, we're not always responding, but we're actually actively out there preventing. And when we look at the vacancy rates in the county for non-sworn staff, and when we look at the vacancies in San Jose for non-sworn staff, the inequities carry over. And I think if we want clean roads, if we want houses that work when we're renters, I think if we start to create a society where people can feel stable and not constantly watched, I think that would build towards us having some equity. So that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Over to Darcy, same question.
Yeah, I don't want equity in policing, and I feel like it's the wrong question to ask. I want equity in the way we invest in communities. I want equity in our neighborhoods. I want equity in our social programs. I want equity so that we prevent an interaction to begin with law enforcement, which we know has long-lasting effects on people, even the interaction, right? Even one day incarcerated, one arrest, right, can have long-lasting impacts on our community, not to mention the cost, right, of that interaction financially to our community. And so I think that's the wrong question to ask, and the better question is, how do we achieve public safety in our community through an equity lens? We don't abundantly or even adequately fund the social programs and the policies we know work. Actually, we regularly underfund the things we know keep us safe, the things we know improve our quality of life, the things we know create happy, sustainable futures for our children. Or we fund effective solutions with way too few dollars for too short of a time and in ways that will not even allow for long-term success. And then we say, well, that didn't work, and so let's just stop, right? The bar is always so high for the solutions that don't center policing. And so what I would rather do is look at neighborhoods and communities and people who have been institutionally neglected through budget and policy and over-invest there, and look at the agencies, Debug, Next Door Solutions, who are here today, others that are keeping people safe when they cannot turn to the police, because there are many people in our community for who the police are not an option, right? And over-invest in that. Communities have been demanding a commitment to creating and adequately funding policies and programs proven to prevent crime, keep communities safe, and ensure our basic needs are met for all residents of our city. And I think it's time that we try some of these other things, because what we have right now, we've been doing for a long time, it just hasn't been working. So I would ask that we think about what equity in policy and budget looks like for communities that continue to be underserved.
Thank you, Darcy. Go to Chief Nikolai.
I am nowhere near as eloquent as Darcy is. My belief is equity in policing, it should be very simpler. No one should be afraid to call the police. Everyone should feel safe in their home, and they should know that if they do need to call the police will come and help them, regardless of who they are, what their socioeconomic background, what their race, what their religion is. That, to me, is equity in policing. Everyone should feel safe. Everyone should feel that they can call the police for help when they need it. And that is, I think the sheriff would agree with me, that is our goal all across the board, all the police departments here in the county.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that if we were to all close our eyes just for a moment, right, and we don't have to, but if you were, and you were to answer a very basic question of, in our hearts of hearts, what is it that we really want in our life? Just think about that for a moment. What do we really want in our life? Every one of us probably have the same wants as far as wanting to feel safe. We want to be free from suffering. We want to be happy, right? Somewhere in that realm. And that's really where the equity comes, is seeing that common humanity piece, working towards that in collaboration. And I will say this, that one of the things, and I know the chief and I and both of us, and well, all of us have been involved in these conversations over the past few years, and some would say they've probably been very challenging conversations, but I've also seen it as an opportunity for us to really, chief and I, to listen to the community and what they want, look at how we're serving our communities, and being part of that equation of reimagining policing. We have done quite a bit in law enforcement because of these conversations over the last couple of years, and really being open to these PERT programs, these collaborations, these alternatives to incarceration, because the reality is public safety, law enforcement is struggling to fill those vacancies. But yet we're still being asked to do everything that we are asked to do. We are more than willing, I would think, if when the other systems are up and ready, to relinquish some of that responsibility. But until then, and the Psychiatric Emergency Response Team program is a perfect example, it took 4 years to actually, from the time the conversation started, to get a mental health clinician in a car with an officer. Because behavioral health is also having challenges finding qualified clinicians, psychologists and psychiatrists who want to work this type of model because of the hours, the expectations, the commitments. So we need to collectively continue to push for these models until they're where we want them to be for our communities. So I'm excited about the next few years, the possibilities. We just can't give up on the momentum that we already have started a few years back.
Okay, thank you, Sheriff. We have several questions left. We may not get to all of them, so just as a heads up to our panelists, we might trim some off the end here. But I'd like to move to a question again for all panelists here. You know, this question is kind of in light of just the most recent high-profile police tragedy, you know, violence that we've seen as a nation with Tyree Nichols in Memphis. But these incidents are obviously very common, and as a nation, we've kind of, I believe, grown accustomed to, for better or worse, absorbing videos and audio and different pieces of media about people being abused by police in different scenarios. And in that vein, my question is, has our society normalized police violence? It has a cost of human lives, as we discussed, and what can we do to change it if we indeed have normalized it as a society? So again, love to start with Derek and then just go around the table. And that's just my framing of it. If you disagree with the framing on the question, please feel free to reframe it and share your answers with us. Thank you.
I appreciate that invitation to reframe. I think for me in particular, and I think for a lot of families who are engaged in this work, like folks at Debug, folks who are in my committee at Rex, I don't think that we've normalized police violence. I think that we are deeply overwhelmed. And if we continue to watch, we have to consider the psychological harm that comes to us. And so while you may see Memphis holding it down, and we appreciate them for what they're doing, there are other folks in other jurisdictions who are exhausted and are trying to find a better way and are trying to move past the noise. But it's really, really hard when you're looking at body cam footage every other month. And so I do not think that we've normalized it. I think that a lot of folks just can't bear to watch anymore.
I think if we've accepted that policing and prisons are a center point of the way that we achieve safety, then we have accepted that we're okay with some violence as a society. Because policing and prisons are violent, disproportionately to some people. And so when I heard this question today, that's what I thought of, was we have already accepted the idea that we are okay with some people being treated brutally, violently, losing their lives if it gives us the perception of safety, which we know has really no correlation to actual safety. And so I agree with Derek that the videos, right, the advent of our ability to see this violence happening right in front of our faces certainly can't be good, although some people have to bear witness. Others may not, right, because of that trauma that it can cause, particularly if you see yourself in that person. And remembering that that's what is caught on video, right? And that it is a violent way to address harm. And police violence is also gun violence, is also violence. And so I hope for a community where we eradicate all violence and we don't use violence, right, to punish or enforce our laws.
Thank you, Darcy. Chief Nikolai.
Yeah, I agree in that I don't think it's normalized, but I don't think it's just police violence. I think violence across the board has almost become normalized in our society. If you watch the news, what do you see? You see violent images, and it's not just police, it is across the board. And that's why in my career, I've seen lately more horrific violent crimes by younger and younger members of society. And so that does worry me. I agree, violence is an issue, and we need to address it sooner rather than later and unnormalize it if that's possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I do think violence in our country is at an unacceptable level across the board, law enforcement included in that conversation. But again, I think that's something over the last few years, agencies, I would hope, have taken that very seriously and put in those protocols and accountability measures and really set the expectation for their workforce that it will not be tolerated. I mean, it goes back to the simple thing that I started with at the beginning. It starts with respect. And we should be treating everyone with respect that's under our care, no matter what. Now, sometimes that's not reciprocated. Sometimes, yes, there's control that has to be, control measures that have to be taken into account to take somebody into custody or whatever it may be, but we can still treat them with respect. And I think that's really, really important to continually drive home, because that's one of the things I think as we move forward is that if we don't start holding people accountable, and Derek brought it up with some of the new legislation that's been passed over the last 2 years, you know, with SB 2 being passed, decertification, we now have a solid mechanism in this state to hold officers accountable and to make sure they never get hired by another agency if they're decertified. And I think that's a starting point, and we have to stay, again, committed to making sure officers that don't abide by the law, policies, and protocols are not part of this profession.
Thank you, Sheriff. You can hold on to the mic. We have a question that kind of transitions into some of what you're discussing there, which is for both of our police representatives here, is reducing use of force a goal in your respective departments? Yeah. And if so, you know, how can your department address and reduce use of force among officers? Because we don't want to assume that reducing use of force has just automatically become police policy writ large. So we'd love to hear, you know, how that policy is in play in your office, if it is.
Well, yeah, I think if you find an executive that says, no, it's not part of their priority, you probably need to start looking for a new executive overseeing your law enforcement. I mean, use of force, reducing it should always be a goal. And again, that's, part of these conversations over the last couple of years. Almost every law enforcement agency now has really taken de-escalation to a whole new level as far as training protocols, policy revisions to really emphasize de-escalating every situation they get engaged with prior to using force, doing everything possible at their disposal prior to using any force. So that is going to be a game changer to make sure that de-escalation is being followed through with to reduce force. And then obviously having accountability measures in place, I think is really important. I've always been an advocate for outside oversight. I've had it in all 3 agencies that I've worked with, as far as LA, Palo Alto, and now the Sheriff's Department. And I think it is important to have an outside body looking at the incidents that you have, providing recommendations and modifying policies and protocols based on those recommendations. So again, I'm excited to be part of this organization, and especially the relationship I have with Oakland and moving forward.
Thank you. Chief Nicolai, same question.
Yeah, just to a little bit more follow-up is one of the keys, I think, is training and more training. So when I became chief, one of the first things I did was I increased the size of our training unit. We now have a training unit of 4 for the size of our department is, I think, pretty impressive. And the de-escalation training, like the sheriff mentioned, is critical. So during a 2-year post cycle, our officers will get about 39 hours of de-escalation training. And a lot of our training is mandated, so we have very specific guidelines, but that just shows you how important de-escalation training is to make sure that we don't want to use force. Officers do not want to use force. They want to solve the situation peacefully, and they just have to be prepared for it. And a well-trained officer will have all the tools available to de-escalate a situation.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to Darcy for our next question. Love to get your perspective on what you see as the most pressing public safety issues facing San Jose and other communities in Silicon Valley. And if you would like to address it as well, how can law enforcement work collaboratively with community members and organizations to address these challenges?
Yeah. Clearly, our runaway social and economic inequality is a major public safety crisis in our county. There is not a coincidence, right, that people feel less safe, even though in actuality, if you guys saw latest data, we actually are more safe in at least this big city of San Jose, but people feel less safe. So that is a pressing issue. If you want to achieve public safety, you have to also close that gap around economic and social inequality. And violence, right? But violence comes in all forms. There's physical violence, there's economic violence, there's lots of violence happening, especially in a society or a valley like ours where we have such in-your-face social and economic disparities. And to answer this question, I want to kind of put a finer point on why I feel so urgently connected to and so strongly about closing these economic gaps and social gaps as a pressing public safety issue. 5 years ago, I experienced harm and violence. And our local police and our local jail was involved in that incident that I experienced. But it was not the police who kept me safe. In fact, at least once a week I dream of what would have been different had the police never been there. And it certainly was not the jail that kept me safe, because I was the one who ended up there instead of who maybe traditionally would have ended up there. I can tell you firsthand what kept me safe, right? So real person, resident here in this county, experienced the jail, experienced the safety of policing. But what kept me safe? The families at Debug kept me safe. The caseworkers at Next Door Solutions to Domestic Violence kept me safe. My sisterhood at the SE Justice Group, who came to all my court dates, kept me safe. A job that didn't fire me kept me safe. The monetary resources that I had to bail myself out, to get an attorney, to be able to care for myself, the fact that I ultimately didn't lose my child, that I had a family who supported me, that I had friends, that I had neighbors, that I had. So if you want to invest urgently in the most pressing matter to keep people safe and out of this system, speaking as someone who experienced harm, invest in that, right? Invest in social safety nets, invest in our connectivity to each other, invest in fair wages, invest in the wealth gap, invest in these organizations. So that, to me, after experiencing that and having been a year working on the RIPS proposals in that committee, tells me that, yes, violence is a very pressing issue in our county, and you cannot decouple it from this runaway social and economic inequality that we're facing, where people don't have the resources they need to keep themselves safe when they are failed by the justice system.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question for Derek, and then we're going to go to our questions from the audience. We might just go a bit over time, so we'll try to keep it as tight as possible, but just a little bit over our hour, since I believe we started just a few minutes behind as well. Derek, there's a lot of news coverage and notoriety around an incident that happened to you in 2020. You were shot by a rubber bullet by a San Jose Police Department officer during a protest in the wake of the George Floyd murder. From your experience, including that event, as well as all of your other work as a community advocate, what advice do you have for individuals who might want to get involved directly in the fight for racial justice and police reform?
So thank you I think I've spent a fair amount of time being very quiet about this after all the news, because it's tiring and hard. But I want to just publicly thank you for those of you who reached out to me or talked to me, sent me cards. Your support really meant the world. It really, really did. I am super, super biased when it comes to what people should try to do. I think that people should join my committee Rex at Sacred Heart. I think we have an amazing bunch of folks who are thinking critically about what we can do to reimagine society the way that we see fit. But also, you should just look around you because the solutions are right in front of us. Most of the time, very critically underfunded, and if we continue to have this back and forth conversation about where dollars should be spent, like general fund dollars will get tied up in other things. And so if you think that there's something out there that's super important, like harm reduction or libraries or hospitals, you should be asking your elected officials to invest in those things, and you bring the whole squad with you when you do. And lastly, just because I know most people who are out there looking for ways to change the world also grapple with hopelessness and despair. And so I think continuing to connect with that squad is everything. Be with your family, be with your loved ones, be with the people you organize with, and continue to ask yourself and look towards that destination you're trying to get to as you hold each other. Both can be true. Both can be things that we can do.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to go to questions from our audience here now. We have a question for our two police representatives here, Chief Nikolai and Sheriff Johnson. The question is this: officers are under tremendous stress, which takes a toll on mental health. What is your department doing to help officers deal with their own stress and maintain strong mental health?
No, that's a great question. We understand that if our officer is not healthy, they are not going to be a good officer for us, and they're going to make poor decisions. So we have created a wellness team at Santa Clara, and this wellness team focuses on not the officers' physical wellness, but also their emotional, mental, and spiritual wellness. And we also make sure we reach out to the families, because a strong family is going to help that officer when they're having a difficult situation. It's difficult to be a police officer, but it's infinitely more difficult to be a spouse, a son, a parent, a daughter of that officer that's going out to face dangers every day. So we want to make sure our officers are equipped, because, again, a healthy officer is going to make good decisions in the field.
So I love this question, and Pat probably knows why I love this question. So I was on Cal Chiefs Officer Wellness Committee, and I've just been appointed the chair of California Sheriff's Association for Officer Wellness. And the reason is I have a background both in mindfulness and compassion cultivation training. And one of the things that I helped develop with the Compassion Institute a few years ago was a program specifically designed for public safety personnel called Courageous Hearts, the Human Behind the Badge. And that's a post-certified program. And it's, again, working with that nonprofit community collaborative effort, designing a program based on their expertise, their components. It was developed actually at a Stanford University, their compassion cultivation training. It's a hybrid of that. But I think that's really important to really work on the mental health, both physically, psychologically, and emotionally for our workforce. Because if they're not well, to the chief's point, they're not going to be able to serve our community well and with compassion. So I think it's a really important part of training. What I've seen over the last couple of years in our profession is the door is opening for agencies seeing the importance of that. And I think as we, as a profession, start sending more of the workforce, to, especially with the compassion piece, to training, they're going to be able to serve their communities better. So I have high aspirations for that.
Okay, thank you. This question is for the whole panel. Anyone who wants to jump out can start, but the question is, what does the anti-racism practices and training look like? So we can have our police representatives offer what is currently in place. And the other part of the question is, are there gaps that you have identified in this training, since this undoubtedly has an effect on policing and public safety? So we could start with one of our two law enforcement reps, and then if anyone from our community panelists want to jump in as well, you can.
Yeah, I think it's the implicit bias training it's excellent training, because as the other panelists mentioned, everyone has bias. I have bias, and once you realize that, you can understand yourself a little bit better, and hopefully you can use that understanding to make better decisions. So we expect all of our officers to go through that training to understand that they have biases. And that's the first step. Everybody has to realize they have biases. And knowing that and addressing that is going to help, again, make a better officer, make better decisions.
Yeah, implicit bias training has become very common. One of the things that I actually really enjoyed, and I think there's a lot of hope for around this area, is something that Palo Alto Unified School District developed with City of Palo Alto during the conversations around police reform. You may have heard of it. It was called the 21-Day Race and Equity Challenge. And what was great about having our personnel engage in that is every day for 21 days, they were going into this program and really learning about other people through the lens of other people. And that was really eye-opening and really powerful. So again, it's those kind of trainings layered on to what we're already required to do, but really presented from outside groups, I think could be very powerful for our profession. So again, exciting opportunities ahead.
Thank you. Derek or Darcy, it's up to you if you want to take on any part of this question. I know you're not leading police forces at this time, but if there's anything about anti-racism training you'd like to mention, or gaps in potential training.
I have to, because I don't want to get caught in like a position of stolen valor, as it were. I'm a community member, and so the work that we did through PACT was community led, and so I have never personally led any police department, yeah. So I think for me, we can get into the nitty-gritty of the training itself, and sort of what it teaches and what people can sort of take from it. I think I just continually return back to the idea that the major whole is that there's just no way to really measure the success of that training. 21st century policing from Barack Obama is like, it's well-intended and well-intentioned. I think there was an honest attempt to try to make some changes happen. But where that, like, we continually come back to this accountability piece. And for this training in general, like, we just do not have data on how many have taken it, what their responses were. I can tell you personally, in a mix of different folks in the crowd, when I used to do the trainings, some people liked it and some people really didn't, and they really didn't. And the diversity trainers that are sort of at the top of their professions, who are working in these police departments, typically say 15% of the department determines the culture. And so how can you measure whether or not you've actually eradicated some of that negative culture, unless like somebody's leaving, or something? I honestly don't have an answer. I think that we honestly just need to look in a different direction when it comes to policing our communities. I think we should be talking about safety for each other.
I just want to add something super quick
Thank
to it.
you.
I don't have an opinion, and I'm certainly not adequately equipped to speak to that issue, but I'd like us to just consider something, right? Our communities face trauma. They're stressed, right? They live in dangerous places sometimes. And I'd like us just to consider, as we leave here at some point, what would become possible if that was met with radical, abundant funding for wellness and family support and education and training. And when we found hotspots in our community, right, hotspots where there were episodes of violence or crime happening, where that was not met with more enforcement, but that was met with the same type of resources that we give to our officers, which I'm glad that they have. But I would love for our communities to also be given that level of benefit of doubt, that they can also change. And also, those type of programs are measurable in community, right? When we see incidents of violence drop in community, so possibly more measurable when they're given out in neighborhoods. Just something to consider, certainly not an expert on that.
Thank you, Darcy. We have a few more minutes, so I think we'll take two more questions from our questions from the audience. I apologize to those whose questions are not going to be able to get read. Perhaps you can grab an email address from one of these fine folks up here and continue the communication afterwards. We have a question here that says, it seems as though only high-profile police killings in other states are the ones that are most often talked about. What are we doing to prevent these kinds of police killings in our own community? Many have been killed by city-trained officers. When has any officer in our community been fired for killing or beating our loved ones? So I'm not going to add any comments to that. I'm just going to read it straight off the card. But again, with the question, you can reframe it if you feel that it's not framed properly.
And, incidents of violence at that level, there's so many accountability measures that have been built in, especially over the last couple of years for officers. Now even at the state level, if an officer uses deadly force on an unarmed individual, that gets investigated by the Attorney General's office. So it has gotten multiple layers of accountability for officer-involved use of force incidents, especially ones involving fatality, the decertification, as we spoke to. The state of California, in my opinion, and it's because we're in California, I think has really set the standard of things that need to be in place as a baseline. And if you compare us to other states, they just don't have that. And I think those are things that need to become national models for accountability. So we start working on standardizing the profession as a whole across the board.
Chief Nikolai? Thank you, Sheriff.
Yeah, just to follow up, it does come back to the training, and our California agencies are head and shoulders above where the rest of the nation is, especially in a lot of these agencies that you see, a lot of these high-profile videos. They just don't have the training or the quality of employees that we do here in California. Now, I'm not saying we're not perfect. Go back to the very first, probably the very first video incident, Rodney King. That was LAPD, which everybody thought was one of the premier agencies. So we are not immune to it. And will it happen again in California? I guarantee it. There is going to be a video out sometime that's going to show something horrific that one of our officers does. And it's unfortunate, and I hope and pray that it is not anytime soon and it doesn't involve any of the officers that are in our area.
Okay, thank you. Question for for our two police representatives, and if our other panelists want to jump in as well. The question is, given that 3 in 10 jail inmates or incarcerated people report having a cognitive disability, and the stat for more general disabilities increases, what training programs are you providing to your dispatchers, officers, and staff to address people with disabilities above and beyond what POST requires and or what's included in crisis intervention training?
Well, let me just start from the sheriff's perspective, because a lot of times those individuals end up in jails, right? And what are we doing about that in the jails? As you know, in Santa Clara County, being under a couple of consent decrees, we had a series of incidents around 2015, 16, 17 that really led to this oversight and these adjustments. So anybody with disabilities, we have an entire division now, bureau, that looks at compliance, making sure they have access to anything they may need. But what I've been so impressed with so far with the sheriff's office is what they're doing around rehabilitation. That's another thing that I've made a priority, is a whole division around rehabilitation. And we just had an excellent write-up by the USC Race and Equity around our college collaborative program that we now have in the jails. And we have 5 colleges that have combined to provide educational opportunities for everyone that's incarcerated, from the moment they come in, all the way connecting them back into the community to continue their education. So I think that type of model is one that needs to be replicated, and even the brief says that we have created a model that should be replicated throughout the state, because we have to give people every opportunity that we can from the moment of incarceration. And I would agree, some people, we all agree, we need to work on alternatives to incarceration. But for those that do get incarcerated, we just can't put them in a cell and forget about them. We have to give them the opportunity to learn what they want to learn, to have programs and access to programs from the moment they enter all the way to the time they get released. And you may have heard me say it, my motto right now is, my goal is for people to graduate out of incarceration rather than just being released from incarceration. And in a perfect world, we'd have alternatives to incarceration altogether. But right now, we're not there.
Thank you. And Chief Nikolai, I know you're not running a county jail, but if you'd like to address how your officers are trained for regular interactions with people with disabilities, that would be great.
Yeah, I think we all understand that if someone has a mental health problem, putting them in jail is not going to solve that problem. And our officers realize that, and that's one of the reasons why we started the Crisis Intervention Specialist Unit, because they can go out, help diagnose what the problem is, and if it is a mental health problem, get them the appropriate resources. One of the things I didn't mention is, like the county PERT teams, our department has received a grant, and we're currently working to bring in a mental health clinician to help our officers, because again, the police shouldn't be doing mental health work. We should be there to protect lives, and a clinician should be there to help. And so that's what our goal is, to get to that.
Okay, thank you. Derek or Darcy, any input on this?
I think maybe the only thing to sort of piggyback on is maybe we need to continue asking this question of where these things kind of live, because it's not as if we don't have a behavioral health infrastructure, although it could be argued that because it's critically underfunded, because it doesn't have enough money to run, and people probably aren't paid enough, we don't really see that infrastructure being a viable alternative. And so when do we start putting those dollars towards outside entities, behavioral health, nonprofits? And I do have to mention too, I would be extremely rude if I didn't. There were a lot of lives lost here in San Jose and in Santa Clara County. Lori Valdez, the wife of Antonio Guzman, is present here today and has experienced a huge tragedy. And I don't like to be the downer, but I do like to call attention and to tell the truth. And it's still happening. And there are many names that we can name that have happened in the last few years. And it's been hard to find accountability, which is why I think we need to restructure. we need to ask new questions.
Okay. Well, thank you to our panelists. I think we're going to wrap up. We're a little bit past 7:10 p.m., so love to just say thank you again to Santa Clara County Sheriff Bob Johnson, Chief Pat Nicolai, Derek, and Darcy. Thank you both, or all four of you, so much for being here, and thank you to our audience. We really appreciate the time. And we'd like to just note, just for anyone watching at home or anyone who's here would like to see this, a video recording of today's panel will be available on our YouTube channel, the San Jose Spotlight YouTube channel. And if you enjoy programming, panels, discussions like this, we hope to do more of them, and as part of our continuing effort to bring information and new light on topics to the community. So please consider supporting our work with a monthly or annual recurring donation in any amount that you can afford. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you again to our sponsors, La Raza Roundtable and the African American Community Services Agency, for your support tonight, and thank you all for being here. Good night. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. What was your name? Francisco. Francisco, thank you. It sounded great. Appreciate your help. What's that? Oh, yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you for managing all that.